a Nintendo competition in my local town, and then I kind of got my foothold in the industry, working on games like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the movie tie-in game for the PS2. So it's kind of a take what you can get, and then get experience, and then get more experience, and so forth. Kind of lesson there. So this is a talk. I guess I could go back and say, what does this talk about? This is a talk about level design for immersive sims specifically. So there will be some some bits on what is level design and what do I do as a level designer. There'll be some bits on what are immersive sims. But the talk is kind of how the two come together and what are the demands and requirements and things that you have to think about as a level designer on an immersive sim project. Yeah, so here we go. The first part, is what is an immersive sim, right? Getting everyone kind of on the same page about that. Yeah, so immersive sim, it can be a kind of a daunting term. There's like this, I'm not expecting anyone to memorize this chart, but there are people with very strong feelings about the sort of subgenre of immersive sims, and this is the kind of family tree of immersive sim games and what forgot what and all that stuff. Just to say that there's a kind of deep lineage to these things. But what are they, right? This is a bunch of games. What do these games have in common? Immersive sims are games with depth and simulation, something like Dwarf Fortress here, roguelikes, things of that nature. But they have the sort of presence and immediacy of a first-person shooter, something like Wolfenstein or things like that. You're embodied in the world in real time, directly touching things, right? You're not like necessarily clicking on stuff or abstracting interactions and things like that. There's an immediacy. But that's the sort of immersive element of it. And there are a lot of notable sort of pillar games in this genre. Things like Ultima Underworld, the Deus Ex games, Thief games, and Far Cry 2 had a very heavy simulational element to it. A lot of Far Cry games kind of have some of that DNA. System Shock 2, and so forth, things of that nature. And then a lot of the games I worked on at Arcane as well took from those and kind of extrapolated and built on those. Immersive sims, because of the simulation element, there's a lot that is not necessarily relies on dice rolls, but there are simulation elements that can result in things like guns jamming or physics. A grenade rolls back down a hill instead of exploding, and then you have to deal with it, or fire propagation, things like that. So it leads to these sort of emergent player stories that are much more, in my opinion, much more dramatic and interesting than if the game told you what happened. It's more interesting than a cutscene or a quick time event or something like that, because all these things come together to make a story that is unique just for you, right? So it's your story, and then you can share that with friends and compare notes and stuff like that. Also, a lot of streamers these days, a lot of Twitch, YouTube streamers, things like that. Those kinds of games are great for that kind of environment because there are unique things that happen and surprise people, and you get reactions and stuff like that. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but immersive sims. This is some slides and things from a talk that Harvey Smith and Randy Smith gave a long time ago back at GDSA. And it was kind of the thing that really clicked in my brain and got me interested in immersive sims as a designer. But the concept of systemic design and if you have these objects over here, for instance, when you place them in the world, you are placing the interactive object, right? You're never placing like a static mesh version of those things. So if there is a barrel in the world, it is a barrel. It is not a mesh that represents a barrel. It is a barrel because it has all the simulation elements of it can explode, it can roll around, it has weight, mass, etc. So there's that aspect, and then there's the and they did a whole talk on these other two images here, so I'm not going to spend time on that. But basically, the gist of these other two slides is everything is broken down into the atomic elements. A fire arrow provides fire, and so does a torch, and so does a candle. And so all of those things provide a fire stimulus. And so if any of them falls into an oil puddle, it will ignite the oil puddle. There's no special piece programming for, if this object falls here, do this, if this object, and so forth. It's like, no, this thing has the property of fire, and so fire is a force in the world, and it will behave consistently regardless of what you do with it or what source creates the fire. And so those are the things that lead to all of those emergent situations where a grenade can roll because of physics and grass can catch on fire and things like that. The thing about immersive sims that we are kind of coming not coming to terms with, but that is becoming apparent is it's not a genre. It's, especially not anymore. It's more of a value system that can be applied to many genres. So first-person shooters can have this. If you look at the newer Zelda games, because of the physics and experimentation and emergent gameplay and stuff, those are very much immersive sim kinds of games. If you look at something like Rogue, Red Faction, not Rogue Faction, Red Faction Guerrilla, something like Teardown. These are not necessarily the traditional first-person shooter, stealthy kinds of things, but they are definitely of the immersive sim sort of DNA. All right, so a little bit on level design. So as a level designer, this is this is sort of like what I do day-to-day kind of stuff. Level designers have a lot of duties that they can perform. It's kind of a very broad-ranging discipline and role. Many studios have their own interpretation of what a level designer is or isn't. But some of the things you can be, the sort of engineer that puts all these clockwork sort of things together, or a more cinematographic, film-minded sort of person where you're like framing things and have these dramatic events that you want to happen. Dungeon Master, of course, is a very obvious analog because of setting up rooms with traps and enemies and treasure and things of that nature, right? Rider, Easter Bunny, you're hiding things for players to find. Trickster, subverter of expectations, that kind of thing. And there were plenty of horrible Easter Bunny pictures that I found, but I'll spare you all and just share that one. But yeah, there are many hats that you can wear as a level designer. And this is more general purpose level design, right? Not necessarily immersive sim. Like this is across the board. Some things level design is not. So you may come in with these expectations, and I teach level design as well. And so some things I have to kind of pry my students' fingers off of, and I guess I should have added programming up here as well, right? You're not necessarily a programmer. You're not going to be building a game from scratch, right? You're not a modeler. You're not going to be making the furniture in the level. Not in a production setting, right? Of a bigger studio. If you're a small indie, then yeah, you might be doing all sorts of things. But if you're getting bogged down in the details of modeling a chair, then you're not really thinking about, well, is this experience going to be fun for the player, or what? That sort of thing. You're not necessarily a director. You're not telling people how to put the level together, right? You're usually in there getting your hands dirty. And then this other image, I see a lot of YouTube sort of like making a quick level in an hour and stuff like that. And really, they are more set dressing than level design because there's nothing really playable. Or sometimes it's just like viewed from one angle or something like that, right? So that's not really level design either, because level design is very iterative process. You get a lot of people to play test your stuff, and then you change it based off of play tests and your sort of intent, at the outset, the sort of brief and what you envision for the level experience. So there's playtesting and gameplay and stuff that I think is left out of a lot of these make the level in an hour, because you'd have to go in and tear that whole castle apart once someone actually set foot in it and was like, oh, I went to the left, and you're like, oh, we weren't supposed to go to the left. I need to build an entire wing, or whatever. There are some intangible skills that you should learn as a level designer. Some of these things you build over time. Some of these things are experience driven or given through experience. But yeah, cross-discipline exposure. A lot of college programs that teach people how to make games nowadays are pretty good about this, where you get to kind of put on several hats and try things out, and knowing how to communicate across departments and knowing a little bit about environment art, programming, etc., but not telling the other people how to do their jobs. So it's kind of a balance, but being able to understand the language of other departments. Communication, knowing how to sell your dream to others, because you will be putting together a lot of the pieces, but you need pieces from other people. And then, in some cases, leads and whatever will be doing this for you, but being able to pitch an idea or prototype something and show it to people and be like, this is why I am excited about this level. You should be excited as well, and this is why, and so forth. Time management and multitasking, knowing how to finish what you start, and scope appropriately. I'd probably talk about that later too, but yeah, finish what you start, because in the middle of the level's development, you can get kind of the doldrums of like, well, nothing really new is happening, and the actual end product is a long way off, and so you have to like stay focused. Staying current, knowing the trends in your trade, what works, what doesn't, and why. Sometimes this means playing games that you aren't interested in or don't like, especially if you're working for a studio that makes games in a different genre than you are, comfortable with or have fun playing, right? So being able to be professional and analyze things and say, well, why don't I like this? Why do other people like this? And kind of separate yourself. Product focus. Know how to pick your battles and tame your ego. There have been many times early in my career where I was like, this is a hill I'm willing to die on, but really it's not necessarily that important in the grand scheme, or it's more important to build bridges with people and understand like, okay, maybe this level doesn't work in the context of the whole game because it's too long or something, right? Problem solving, knowing how to make ideas work, and within constraints. Within constraints is the key part here, because sometimes you won't be given the resources you need, or sometimes you need to work within a budget, right? And so being able to do that is super useful, and more useful than coming up with creative ideas. Is coming up with creative ideas that work, right? Enthusiasm, knowing how to stay positive without artifice. Not being a cheerleader and like grinning artificially all the time. But yeah, and this kind of depends on the studio and depends on the project. A lot of the times, if you're new, it's a lot easier. I will hire juniors to kind of feed off of their energy, and use it to revitalize myself. Understanding tech debt. This is kind of related to some of the above, like the time management or the product focus maybe. But it's very easy to say, oh look, I got this thing working. Like the player can ride this elevator. They push a button and this thing moves, and they ride the elevator. So I'm gonna move forward and assume elevators are a thing. But really, there's this entire iceberg of tech debt. The engineering and all this other stuff that has to go in to make this thing actually functional. Because like, oh yeah, well if you hop off, then you die, or the NPCs can't ride the elevator, or these other things. So knowing that getting something just in is like 10% of the battle, and then polish and doing the correct real version is a whole other issue. All right, part 3. So these are the immersive sim design values. My personal take on them, I guess, and how they fit in with the level designer, the level design goal, and all that. All right, yeah. So how does level design fit in with immersive sims? Immersive sims, they have a much deeper focus, or a much more important focus on interacting with the environment with the player's abilities. So you'll see a lot of games where the player has this suite of tools, but really they're just for combat or just for interacting with NPCs or something like that. But immersive sims usually have a tool set that also interacts deeply with the environment. So it has something that can catch people on fire, but also there are oil puddles or a hay bale or grass or something like that, and that can also catch fire. And so now that becomes something the level designer has to more actively think about, rather than just a combat designer or something like that, and can leverage. And it's a very sort of beneficial kind of relationship between the player tool people and the level design people and all that stuff. So it's something you have to think about as a level designer in that environment, rather than just saying, well, this is a combat space and I just need a footprint for combat. Here's a hall that connects the combats together and that's it. But no, you can actually do cool things. And with puzzles and challenges and stuff like that, that can leverage the player ability. Importance of the environment, or environmental interactions impacting the narrative. So something else that immersive sims tends to have is the player impacting the story, impacting the narrative at a high level through their actions. So you'll see a lot of games like the Mass Effects and things like that. I guess Baldur's Gate is actually more on the immersive sim end of things in this regard, but some games will cordon off the important choices to like cutscenes and dialogue trees and stuff like that. But immersive sims are more about putting that weight or that importance or that impact directly in the player's hands in their moment to moment when they're using their verbs in the space. And so this makes the player feel like they're an active participant in the world, and what they do matters versus them just killing time until they get to the next important bit with a dialogue option or something like that. An example here is from my Dishonored level where you're trying to poison somebody, and everything you do in that room can directly impact the outcome of whether that person lives or dies and all this other stuff. But it's not, I was decrying dialogue trees, but some of the interactions here can be chosen from a menu, but you can also like more directly, you can smash the bottles and stuff like that. Another thing to think about design values with immersive sims is the abdication of authorship, and it kind of goes down the chain. So having the narrative team up at the top, or the creative director, or whatever, having them say, no, it's okay if the level design team takes on some of this work and responsibility and all that stuff. And then in turn, the level designers are like, okay, it's all right if the player actually gets to participate, and we let the player handle some of the drama, some of the interesting bits. And I'll talk some about that later as well. But like this is another example from Bioshock 2, from my level at the end of the game, where you have to escape this prison wing in one of the sections of the level, and it was up to the player to figure out how to get out. There were several ways I kind of seeded throughout, and then it's like, okay, player, how do you want to do this? And it was one of the more sandboxy bits of that game. I think it kind of went a little left field there, but it's something like something like Hitman or something like that. Those are very abdicating authorship to the player, and they craft the story with all the tools that they are given. There's a high level, at the end of a Hitman level, someone's going to die, but how you get there is very different depending on the player's action. Truth in layout. So another thing that we at Arcane were very adamant about was if the player can see a place, they can get to that place. If you see an open window with light coming out, then there better be a room in there, because we wouldn't want to fake the player out and make them think there was something that was just there for visual effect, just set dressing or whatever. My example here is from Prey. When we built out the simulation labs in the beginning of the game, there was a very sort of tight knot of the apartment, the fake apartment, and then the labs that were observing the apartment, and then the labs around those, and the hallways that connected them. And we could have faked some things with like teleportation and stuff like that, although we didn't have a map system that kind of kept us honest. But no, we really wanted to build out the space as it would actually be, and then that kind of extended to the entire space station. So the entire station was a big contiguous. It was split up by level loads, but everything kind of fit together like it should. And so there wasn't a corner of the space station that you couldn't get to that you're like, I wonder what's over there. And it's just an abstracted skybox, right? We didn't do skyboxes in that regard in our levels. Affordances. So this is a term from a guy named Donald Norman. Has a book called The Design of Everyday Things that I generally recommend to my students. It's about doorknobs and teapots and things like that, but it's also very much about level design and interaction design indirectly. But he repurposes or kind of piggybacks off of this term someone else created called affordance, and it's basically what an object does, what its use is. And then you've got conveyance, which is sort of how obvious its usage, right? So what is an object's use? How does the player learn this use? And so that is a very important thing in immersive sims because they're very densely interactive environments. And so you want the player to be able to know what's interactive, what is not interactive. An example here, this button, very obviously interactive. And you have to think about the interaction scale of the world and stuff that you're working with. In this case, anything that's going to be interactive is roughly, the player has, hands the size of like hands or something like that, right? Like, pound a button or throw a switch or something like that, then you can be pretty safe. So anything interactive is within that range. So like buttons, for instance. And then this is something we started to think about a lot whenever we transitioned to Redfall, and I kind of made this chart for the team because the nice thing about Prey and Dishonored was they were completely fabricated worlds. So they still have human beings walking around. They're not like a cocoon or something like that where it's like alien, but they were fabricated. So if we wanted there to be buttons or med kits or whatever, we would craft them with this visual language from the ground up. But in mini games, and in mini games that are set in the modern day, in the real world, or something like that, you think about this sort of overlap, and you still have to think about some of this in something like Dishonored or Prey. But you've got these overlaps of affordances and assumptions that the player is going to bring with them to the game. So you've got cultural affordances, and that's sort of like I am a human being that operates within the world, and so I have some expectations of things. Like a phone, you can pick up and call people. A button you can press. An ATM you can get money out of. Things like that. Computers, I can type on computers. Just sort of human interaction expectations from a modern world. Cultural affordances. And then on the other hand, you have genre affordances. So things that are built up expectations based off of what kind of genre you are working in. So if it's a first-person shooter and you see a pressurized tank of gas, you're going to expect I shoot that and it explodes because this is a shooter. Whether or not they really do that in real life or not or whatever, that's your expectation. You see a fire extinguisher on the wall and you're like, oh, I shoot that and it will explode, and so forth, right? And some of those can sort of oppose cultural affordances, like the fire extinguisher, for instance. You might not expect that you could pick it up and use it to spray and put out a fire. Depending, maybe not. And depending on the genre, you may or may not expect to be able to pick up a payphone and use it, depending on how deep your interaction set is and things like that. And then on top of those two, you've got the third sort of pillar or whatever I'm calling this, the third sort of slice of project-specific, studio-specific values. So if it's if the studio is like, okay, we always want you to be able to pick up any kind of physical object and throw it, right? Like Prey was very much about anything that's physical will be physical. Anything that is like of this size or bigger can be picked up, thrown, and mimicked, right? You could turn into physical objects. So that was a demand that the project had. Then that fed into the studio's values of consistency and things like that, right? And then in some cases you'll have, for a very specific mission, you can maybe bend the rules just a little bit, like you need to bring some popcorn somewhere or something, right? And so you don't normally make popcorn in popcorn machines, but maybe you do for this one mission or something like that. So you can bend the rules a bit as long as you're not breaking them too much and ruining consistency. So speaking of that consistency, is a concept I termed interaction buffering, right? So whenever you have interactive objects in the world, especially if you're using a real world or a real world analog, you're going to have, especially like with an art team, a very sort of active art team is going to want to do set dressing and stuff that mimics the real world. And if you have something like first aid kits, for instance, like you're building out a veterinarian clinic or a hospital or something, they're going to want to set dress with these sort of medical stations on the walls. But if you're making a first-person shooter where the player has any kind of med kits that they use at all, they're going to look at that and say, hey, I'm bleeding out here. I'm going to go use that thing. Oh, it's just set dressing. Now I'm dead, and now I'm returning your game or something like that. So you want to keep a very clear language, or you want to, the other, and it kind of goes both directions or both options here. You also need to work with the art team to make sure that they are adhering to visual language and things like that. And sometimes it means, well, you don't get to put that there as set dressing, right? Or maybe you do let them put it there, but they have to put the interactive one, and then you as the level designer need to accommodate. Okay, there's a med kit here. Is that okay? Does that ruin my encounter if they have an extra med kit or whatever? The other way to go is something like Half-Life here, where all the med stations are very obviously weird med station combine technology sort of something, but you're not going to mistake it for anything in the real world, and no artist. It's like, oh, I want to set dress this place. Oh, I'll put one of these weird machines here. They're not going to do that. So that is another sort of safe route to go. Another thing to think about on Prey were computer screens, right? We wanted to have interactive computer screens, but it's a space station full of computers, and so we needed ways to say, okay, well these computers aren't active, and so we would just we would turn them off or make the screen static or something like that. So um, safe ways to unask the question. There was the concept of unasking the question became pretty important on Redfall. It was a matter of, okay, you build out an apartment. Um, what's weirder, not having light switches, or having a light switch that the player can't use when they can use other lights in other places, right? So we had to have those conversations a lot. Like, what's more strange, the presence of something that doesn't behave like it should, or the absence of something the player might just bypass? And then, yeah, along these lines as well, going back to the poisoning scene from Dishonored, we have these bottles of wine everywhere, and this bottle in particular is, it's a plot bottle. It's important to this scene, but we didn't want to make it special and static and non-breakable because all the other bottles you can pick up, you can throw, you can break. So if the player comes in here, sees this bottle and breaks it, I authored an entire branch to this encounter where the guy trying to poison the other guy has this contingency plan. And they go off to the side, and there's a whole thing. And I could have found other ways around it if I wanted to be sneaky or something. Maybe, I don't know, a cage or something. But I thought that was more interesting anyway. And then you get people that find these little branches and stuff, and it's special and interesting to them. And then I also went and added still the glasses to the menu here. The original version of this was like a little lazy Susan you could rotate, and that was the actual interaction, was just rotating this thing back and forth, but it wasn't reading to players, and so we had to make it a little more obvious. It's a bit of a failing, I think, on my part, but I think it came out okay. There are certain hills you can die on, and certain concessions you can make that are just fine. One thing I always try to push in level design for immersive sims is the player as participant and not audience. So this means don't take away the camera from them. Don't do cutscenes in the middle of the level if at all humanly possible. Things like that. And Half-Life is a great example of that ethos, that sort of mentality where everything that happens in the world, and they trust that the player is going to notice the interesting things, and if they don't, that's okay. They frame it, pretty deliberately, but if the player is just like looking at their feet and backing up or something like that, then so what? It's more interesting if you see it with your own eyes and your own sort of thumbsticks than if the game is like, here, look at this. We spent money on that bridge collapsing. We're gonna make you look at it. It's like, okay, well now every single person that walks through here sees the exact same thing. That's not necessarily interesting. I have biases. Some other design values. Level layout. Supporting true exploration. So kind of what I was talking about before. If you can see it, you can get there. So like some of the Dishonored levels had these side streets and things like that. There were lots of spaces that were side spaces, and they were completely optional, but they had interesting stuff in them. And if the player poked around and found these things, they would get this exploratory sort of experience, and it was a more unique kind of moment. Power of backtracking, System Shock 2 does this really well. You get this really intimate sense of the layout of the space by the end of the game. They're also recontextualizing the space with all the abilities and stuff you get, so you're just hauling butt through the hallways and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily a slog. Backtracking can be bad if it's done poorly. Some of the later levels of the first Halo, or like the Tower of Time or whatever in Phantom Hourglass Zelda game, a lot of people have problems with because you're going back in the same exact configuration and have to just do the same stuff over. But it can be useful in building a knowledge of a place and developing a sense of space and place, because this feels like a real place because I'm going back and forth. I'm not going down some tube that is leading me from plot point to plot point to plot point. The other thing, and I guess this kind of goes under layout, I'm just kind of sticking this in here, but consistency in metrics. This kind of goes to the same effect as the interaction buffering and stuff. Metrics buffering. This is something Amelia Schatz wrote up an article on this, and this is a great image. but making sure that any of your metrics are very obviously within the frame of the metric, so you don't get any kind of confusion as to like, oh, okay, I thought I could take cover, but it's actually 5 centimeters shorter than half height cover, and you get shot in the head and you return, and so forth. Or I tried to make this jump, but it was actually 5 centimeters higher than I could actually jump, and I didn't make it, and I got frustrated. So making sure there are these zones that are like no go, and you have to communicate that to the art team, and that's a big part of level design is being able to talk to other departments and not like lay down the law, but actually make sure everyone's on the same page, but making the experience great for the player. Alternate paths. So this is another big thing in immersive sims. Is the exploration thing kind of leads to this concept of alternate routes to get to places of import. So one thing we came across, or one thing I learned about when I got on Dishonored was something they called the Deus Ex effect, which is basically you've got this long sort of hallway, this complex, and a target room at the end. There's a vent system that you could find that leads all the way to the target room. But maybe you miss that. You go down the hallway, you get to the room, and you see a vent, and you're like, "Hey, I want to take this vent and see where it leads." And then you get out of the vent, and you're like, "Oh wait, I'm back at the beginning. That sucked." Or worse, you don't know that you're back at the beginning. You're like, "Oh, where am I now?" And then you get turned around. So finding ways to combat that and make sure you've got a strong enough orientation or landmarking or things like that to prevent that from happening. Um, yeah. Also with alt paths, you have to make sure that the reward for the effort matches what you get on the other side. So if you have to go find all these things to piece together a code, or have to have some kind of special ability, or go talk to a guard or something like that. Just making sure that if there are alternate paths, each of them is roughly equivalent, so there's not the obvious way, and that what you get at the end is worth the trouble, especially if it's optional content. And similarly, rewarding players' playstyles without making them feel dumb. There are certain skills in certain games that are just the obvious skill that you get, and it's like, oh, if you don't get hacking, then you're gonna miss out on like half the game, or you're gonna have to do all this, drudgery, this grunt work to actually get into all these places. But if you have hacking one, then you're gonna get past stuff. So making sure that you're rewarding, and it's a tricky balance. There's a lot of pull-based narrative in immersive sims, and this is narrative that the player kind of finds on their own, and it's usually off the crit path. Usually, you'll have your crit path beats that are push-based, which is like a radio message comes in, or there's a cutscene between levels, or a mission briefing, or something like that. That's your push-based narrative. That's the stuff that the player has to know, otherwise they're going to be lost and all that stuff. And then uh, pull based is all the stuff around that, and it's world building, and it could be related to your mission. It could be stuff that you can learn to find like an alternate route or something. Like in my level in Dishonored, you can overhear some guards talking about the heretics brand, and it's an alternate way to deal with the guy if you don't want to kill him and stuff like that. This scene here is from Gone Home, and it's a pretty good example of environmental storytelling. You can tell exactly what happened here. You can have, and again, cultural affordances of I've had sleepovers before with people. We built pillow forts and stuff like that. One thing you have to be careful with environmental storytelling, and this game kind of trades on, oh, this is kind of spooky what happened here, but it feels very much like this was interrupted abruptly and something happened, and now the people are gone and they left the pizza box out and the cards are just like left there. You may as well have like a smoking coffee mug or something, steaming mug, because they're just gone. So that's something you have to be cognizant of, and also try to avoid blood graffiti because it's way overdone. So player motivation is a big thing in immersive sims. Immersive sims, they're more work for the player because you're not just pushing them through the story. They're not just going cutscene to cutscene or down a long hallway. They have to kind of experiment, explore, and use their brain a little more. And this can be taxing on the player. I discovered this when I was working on Prey. I was like going to go home in the evenings and play through Dishonored 2 because it did come out, and I was like, wow, I'm exhausted, and this is a lot of work. So they can be more demanding on people, and so there's nothing wrong with even Half-Life, right? Half-Life is a more linear game. Beat to beat, you're not like figuring out where Gordon needs to go. You're taking the roller coaster ride. So I'm not necessarily saying there's a flat value judgment to linear games are bad or something like that. Because immersive sims are definitely, they can be an acquired taste. You have to kind of make some of your own fun. Um, yeah, but that can be more rewarding when you create a plan and see it through and all that stuff. Intentionality and agency top to bottom, that's kind of what I'm also getting at here. The player forms a plan, executes the plan, and it works or doesn't work, and then they have to scramble and all that kind of stuff. So supporting that as a designer. And to support that, there are a few things you can use. World building and setting can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So if you look here, this is in Prey as well, and your goal is to reset the reactor in the space station, right? So you can pretty easily say, okay, look, there's the power plant. I need to get to the power plant, and there's the reactor room, and down at the very bottom is where the reactor is, and that's your goal as a player. And so it's very easy as a level designer to support that and then complicate that. It's like, okay, getting down there is going to be dangerous, and we're going to put some things in your way, but I don't have to communicate anything extra to the player along the way, because it's like, no, I got to get down there. That's where I reset the thing. It's a power plant. This is a station. There's a power plant, and so when you get into alien environments and fantasy environments, you can get into trickier situations where it's hard to have that sort of setting doing the heavy lifting for you, because it's like, this is the mysterious crystal tree, and there are crystals, and it's like, then you have to go through exposition and stuff and explain to the player what's going on, or maybe it's not a big deal. Like, I think Elden Ring does a great job of, this is a weird environment, fantasy world. They're not going to explain it. They don't need to explain it, and you manage to find your way through, and it holds together. Then on the other end, context and power fantasy can also do a lot of the heavy lifting. So again, if you're an assassin, there's a target. You want to take out the target. When the target stops breathing, you have won. So then, as a level designer, all I've got to do is put things in the way, and it's kind of a fun playground of design where it's like, okay, what can I do to complicate this? Because the player's going to be pushing towards that because it's a very obvious goal. I don't have to like pull them along and lead them. They're going to be steamrolling towards the target. That's great. That makes my job a lot easier, and it makes their experience a lot more enjoyable and rewarding. One sort of formula we used at Arcane was create the problem, then present the obstruction to that problem, and then the player can find the solution to that obstruction. We call it finding the lock before the key, because if you find a key on the way to the lock, then there might as well have not been a key or a lock, because you just found it along the way, especially if they're within proximity to each other. And you could say, well, I find the key, that means, oh, I need to find the lock. But the thing about finding the lock first is you know what is on the other side of the lock, right? So problem, destination, goal, and then the obstruction. So then, I've got to get out of the tower. There's a door that is locked, and that is blocking my way out of the tower. And so now I know that finding the key is related to my goal of getting out of the tower. So it all kind of holds together, and you have a sort of through line of motivation of like key equals out, that sort of thing. Similarly, or relatedly, self-evident goals, and this is kind of what I touched on a second ago, these are much more easy to design because you don't have to, again, you don't have to drip feed the player or have companions explain like, oh no, the orange crystals rotate counterclockwise, but the green ones rotate clockwise. And so if you find the mystic bow, it's like you don't have to do that if it's just get across a gap, right? And Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom show that get over a gap can actually be pretty interesting. If the player has this suite of tools and expressive capabilities, then you can just have a problem that's like, yeah, get over there. And they can do interesting and cool stuff and have fun doing it, rather than explaining some sort of convoluted, Rube Goldbergian puzzle to them. All right, production and process. So this kind of goes back to the just general level design things with a bit of immersive stuff that I'll layer in near the end. So when we develop levels, and most, I guess, caveats, right? Like all studios have nuances, and sometimes they have different processes and things like that. But the general process is as follows. You've got your concept phase, and this may happen with all levels simultaneously. And they may all go through this process, in parallel. Depends on the size of your studio. Sometimes you'll do a handful of levels and then a handful of other levels, or maybe they're staggered, right? It's generally a bad idea to do all the levels at the same time because you learn lessons while building a level. That's like, oh yeah, that was a bad way to do that for this game. So let's do it better next time. And most of the time, you shouldn't build your first level first because it's going to be the first thing the player experiences, and you want it to be the most polished thing. So finding some sort of scrub level in the middle, something like that. But anyway, the concept phase is where creative direction or the overarching narrative or whatever will present you with what you need. So it's like, okay, this is near the end of the game where the big climax is happening, or this is the scary level, or this is takes place on a submarine, or you're trying to find this or whatever. So you'll have a high level direction, ideally abstract enough for you to then, as a level designer, get your own sort of you know hands in there and work on it. And sometimes the process is collaborative, and you actually get to have a say in the building of the concept as well, um, and so forth. Then there's the paper map phase. These are a few paper maps I've done for various things in the past. Some you can tell the sort of range here of you know uh, sketchiness to polishedness. Usually, more polished is worse, unless you're done and you're like, I'm going to present this to someone that has money to give me or something like that. Generally, you want these things to be quick and dirty, so you can get the idea down, the relationships of the rooms, the size of the rooms, and things like that, and then get into the engine. And do that as quickly as you can, because as soon as you get in the engine, it's going to speak a lot more to you. But you do want to have a plan going into the engine, so it's a delicate balance. And then again, some people, some studios are much more happy doing very elaborate paper maps. Some people don't. From there, you go into gray box, and that is a very rough blockout. And again, like Blocktober, just happened. Although Twitter is kind of a dumpster fire at the moment, and maybe it's moving over to some other social media platform. But it's a yearly thing where people show up with block meshes, their blockouts, their gray boxes, the levels, and then it's helpful for people to see, oh, this looked like trash in the very beginning, because most levels do look like trash in the beginning. The thing you don't want to do is have an overly arted up fancy gray box. You want to get your proportions in and then be able to move it around. The point of paper map and gray box is you're working as cheaply as possible, going through as many ideas as possible. I had a drawing professor that said the best way to get a good drawing is to make 1,000 bad drawings. So the more you can iterate, the more rapidly you can iterate. You can say, nope, that didn't work, and throw it away without being precious about it. Because if it didn't take much effort to make, then it won't take much effort to replace. And so you want to go through that and say, okay, this works, this doesn't work. And ideally, in the concept phase, you have this sort of brief or guiding pillar. You're like, I want to get closer towards that, or towards that experience that I wanted. And you can tear out a room, add a room, whatever. Production is when you've got, depending on the studio, hopefully you've had enough time in gray box to get something that is enjoyable with whatever verbs and mechanics you have. Sometimes you don't have all the mechanics up front and have to kind of fake it until they come online. But then this is when you and an artist start working together, bringing your stuff into the same map, and going back and forth and iterating and polishing and all that stuff. And you have cycles of reviews and all that. As a whole, I can give another hour talk on that. Yeah, that's the main engine of development, where you're building the thing out, testing it with people, and so forth. And you're beginning to see things take shape, like, oh, there's this animated scene behind this window, and now it's in, and now I'm feeling things about, now the sound is in, I could actually have emotions and stuff like that. So yeah, and this is usually the biggest, longest phase. And then wrapping up, not me yet, but wrapping up your level, there's a quote, good art, or art is never finished, only abandoned, or something like that. But usually a producer will, pry the level out of your hand at some point and ship it, right? And sometimes there's, cutting room floor, or there's stuff you have to remove. There's a lot of polish that goes in, and this goes way back to the tech debt that I was talking about, where you're like, oh wait, that idea I had is actually a whole lot of work to make it look good with animations and stuff like that. But yeah, and going through these cycles, and this is where junior people become whatever standard, and standard becomes senior. Experiencing this cycle is how you learn and get instincts and know what not to do and what to do and all that kind of stuff. So this kind of gets back into a little bit of immersive sim stuff. At Arcane and on Bioshock 2 also, we had this pairing of level designers and architects who were basically environment artists that had a lot of level design know-how, as well as dealt with the layout, the actual end product layout of the level. And any really close relationship like that can have any of these sort of permutations of nemesis or best buddy or whatever, depending on what phase of the project you're in as well. But you're joined at the hip, and so you're trying to work together to build the level. It's not like, oh, your art messed up my design or your design messed up my art. Ideally, you've got the clear vision that you're working towards, and it's like, oh, together we made the asylum or the cruise ship or whatever, and it's it's a joint venture because it can be very easily contentious if someone is editing the art and then all of your patrol paths got stepped on or something like that because they weren't running around in the level, or the collision's gone today or something like that, right? So you want to make sure you're eye to eye. A couple of things, again, immersive sim kind of stuff. Working with systems designers and engineering, because like I said earlier, there are a lot of player verbs that directly relate to interact with the environment. And as a level designer, you're going to want to know all those things and influence those things and stuff. So like, oh yeah, there are key cards and key codes. There's a hacking system. Stuff can catch on fire. Things like that. So you want to be in touch with the systems team, the gameplay team, and the engineers that build all that stuff. And generally, there's a sort of circular communication amongst those, at least the leads of those departments. So it all gels together because it's like, oh yeah, they made this really elaborate flame propagation system, but this whole game takes place in concrete, brutalist, abandoned office spaces, and there's no grass or carpet. That sort of thing. It's usually not that bad, but there could be miscommunication. And like I mentioned way earlier with the systemic design thing, making sure that there are no static versions of would-be interactive objects. This is a screenshot from the bridge on Prey, where there's a piece of paper on that pedestal that haunts me to this day. I can feel it there in all the games that are shipped. It looks like it should be interactive. It's a singular piece of paper that means README, and it's static, and it's shipped with the game. So yeah, making sure that you have enough of a system in place so that when people place things, they have to place the interactive version or something like that. And lastly, markup versus systemic. You always want, and this is generally a push back and forth between engineers and designers. Systemic means the game will find, like if you have a mantling system or cover for NPCs to duck behind objects when being shot at, you have systemic versions where they will find that stuff dynamically using sweeps and brains and sensors and stuff like that. It's usually more computationally expensive. But the alternative is markup, where you hand place like, okay, an enemy can take cover behind this box. I'll put a markup bit here that says, yeah, you can take cover here. But then if that box moves, now the markup has to also move, and sometimes it can be embedded in the box, and that's kind of like maybe a middle ground that works out. But that means there's a ton of inconsistency that can happen. It's like, oh, I didn't put a marker behind every box, or there were some boxes added, or whatever. And now you've got inconsistency, you've got bugs, and all this other stuff that crop up. Not to mention a bunch of extra work on the level design team or the art team or something. Someone has to go in and hand place this stuff, and it's like an open world or something. Then you're in a world of hurt. I think that that wraps it up. It's kind of an abrupt ending, but that is what I got.
Okay, awesome. We do have a few questions here. I'm just going to go ahead and begin approving them so we can go ahead and hear them. Albert, I know you also posted a question earlier. I'm not sure what happened to it, but if you still want to ask, you can go ahead and just turn on your mic and say it out loud. Yeah, we are recording right now, and we will be sharing it through the Discord for Game Dev. So. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read Albert's question. He asked a question earlier. Where's the line drawn between level design and environment art? Where each part of the environment is meant to be interactable. The specific example he pulled up was something like Enter the Gungeon, where you have tables that can be part of the environment, but they're also meant to be knocked over and are a major element of gameplay. Where do you draw the line in terms of these need to be placed in terms of the environment that you're building compared to the gameplay needs of the game?
Yeah, something like Enter the Gungeon probably had one person handling the level design and art. Probably, I imagine it was like a kit that they were able to build from. So like I was mentioning with only placing the interactive version, I imagine those tables were like, this is the table and it's got all the properties in it, and that's kind of how you handle it in bigger scale games as well. It's like the only table you can place is the breakable one. The static version is in a folder that says like do not place or something like that. And so anything that goes into the game is the interactive one. And then this is also why the architect role was so crucial at Arcane, was you have someone that kind of straddles the line, so you can work with that person and they understand the gameplay needs as well as the art needs, and they can, anytime something is coming through for art, they can be like, oh, but what if the player does this or that? What if the player steps on that? Or what if this blocks the player, and that kind of thing. But it's sort of an ad hoc relationship, and so you have to find the right pairings of people, because like in some cases, some level designers were much more interested in doing the block out and the layout and having an artist come in and just like decorate it. And in some cases, you had a level designer that's like, here's a box, and I need a smaller box connected to that. You can make it a barn or a Victorian house or whatever. I just need a big box and a little box. And then the artist would be like, woohoo, I can do whatever I want. So you had these sort of relationships that were, dependent on the pairing. And you just had to kind of play by ear, and that was the strength and the weakness of that system. But so I think the main thing is the consistency in the way you play stuff and communication openly between the two, because you could easily have like, okay, I need to place a breakable table here, but the environment artist is like, this is a bedroom, what are you doing? And then I need something breakable, and then they can work with you, and that's pretty good. I think you're muted.
My bad. I have a question here from Kai. During your concept phase, what is commonly used to create some of those concepts? Do you mostly work in pen and paper? Do you use any AI generation or internet images, or are you working, with a concept artist?
That's a good question. Have not gotten deep enough into the realm of AI generated stuff for that to come up. Concept art is a big thing. Sometimes it depends on the size of the studio. Usually there's like a concept artist at a studio of like 100 people. That's so it can be a rare commodity. A lot of the times when I work with environment artists and architects and things, they'll have a pure ref is the tool they use, and they'll go out and get all sorts of reference. And the thing I always recommend when you're getting reference is never get reference from games. Always find real things. Even if you're doing something like, this is an alien facility, then look at like, okay, well, what do we want to inspire the alien facility? If you look at something like BioShock, it's like, okay, well, this is an undersea city. There's not really any precedent for that. They're like, okay, well, let's look at Art Deco, and that became the sort of through line, right? So looking at similar stuff, with Prey, we didn't have. I mean, the space station reference we've got it's about the size of my house, right? It's like a football field, maybe, I guess, so bigger than my house, but it's it's very small, like tubes, and that wouldn't be very fun to play in. So we have to look at other things like office buildings and whatever. But just going out there and finding books or whatever, and being versed in architecture helps. And that's why the architect role is also very useful. They're like, hey, I was just studying up on 1950s something, and they're like, that's amazing. That's super cool. And then you can get like interactive inspiration from that stuff as well. Like, oh, here's the way this sort of water pumping system worked, and we can use that for this other thing, and that sort of deal.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure you're still good on time, right?
Yeah, I've got plenty of time.
Okay, cool. Just a question here from me, actually. Where does level design kind of start in terms of how you do your paper maps? I remember reading, I think it was Harvey Smith talking about when he was working on Deus Ex, that he kind of started by, mapping out real places and trying to build his environments as realistically as possible. Especially for an immersive sim, I feel like that would be a pretty useful process. Is that something that you've ever done?
Well, somewhat. When I was working on Bioshock 2, we had my level was the sort of asylum slash prison slash hospital, and so I looked at a lot of Kirkbride asylum, like from the Victorian era, 1900s or something. Anyway, a lot of these layouts of these old asylums, and would use those as reference for like, oh, okay, these wings here come off, and there's a hub and all this stuff. So using that is maybe not directly building out the exact floor plan, but using it as very heavy inspiration. Same with Darksiders. My level, I don't think anything that I did in that ended up shipping in the final game, but my level was a cathedral, and so I was like, okay, let's look at actual cathedral architecture, and I did a straight top-down view of a cathedral that was a copy of a plan from an existing cathedral, and use that as a building or stepping stone to build off
of. Okay, awesome. For you, what makes a good competitive map, and how would you approach designing it if you have any multiplayer experience?
I don't have a lot of multiplayer experience, but I think good competitive maps have interesting gimmicks in them. Like, and again, I'm not a competitive level designer, so like I always liked the old Half-Life deathmatch maps, like Snark Pit or something, where you would like hit a button and the trapdoor would drop into the acid and things like that, so you could like get one over on people that didn't know the map as well or something. So interesting interactive gimmicks in the environment are cool that make this map different from this map, different from this map. I think that's enjoyable.
All right. What would be the best way to practice designing levels? What advice would you have for people who are new to level design?
So, and this is something I tackle in my class as well. The problem with level design education these days is there are fewer and fewer games that ship with tools to make levels for the game. For whatever reason, there's a lot of like middleware or console or whatever. So find an existing game engine, something like maybe Skyrim or I think Hello Neighbor was something that they did at the guild hall. Find a game with a tool built in and learn that and make examples with that, because if you're just doing Unity bare bones, if you're just doing Unreal bare bones, you're not level designing because there are no mechanics to level design for, right? Unless if you can find like a bare bones, like, oh yeah, here's a lock and key system, here's a quest system or something like that. Building around those kind of mechanics and constraints and goals it's how and then once you do that, find playtesters, find people to set it in front of, watch them play it, and then iterate on like, oh, okay, they did what I wanted them to do, they didn't do what I wanted them to do. And then the other part of that is when you are watching someone play your level, you have to say nothing. It is very hard to do. We had a separate like observation room at Arcane where we would have to watch, and someone would just go in circles for half an hour in a room, and you're just like, ah, you feel so bad for them, and you want to just bust into the room and be like, I'm so sorry, like, please forgive me, but you can't, because you can't ship with the game, so you have to be able to, have the game speak for itself.
Mm-hmm. Would you recommend older games that have mod tools, stuff like Quake? Because I know those are a lot simpler to get levels out of pretty quick.
I would say, yes, something like Quake or Doom. Doom has a very vibrant mapping community. I guess I'm gonna move my screen. Hold on, I'm just staring off to the right. Let me do this. I'll stop sharing. Does that work? Okay. Yeah. Doom has a very active community for mapping, and it's very easy to get something up and running. A guy named Steve Lee. He has a bunch of really good videos on level design, and he has a great series on like, here's how to get a Doom level up in 5 minutes. Something like Half-Life. In fact, if you can do Half-Life editing, Half-Life 2 editing, you're working in Hammer, and Hammer is like what they did Alex and stuff like that. So that still has some actual modern ramifications and applications. So I would recommend that. The problem with some of the older, there are a lot of newer tools for older games that make them more easy to make or work with. But the problem with a lot of older tools, like if you want to do old thief mapping or something like that, the tools are super hard to figure out, or maybe they break or something like that. So just make sure you're using whatever modern wrappers there are on the old tools.
Okay. How do you approach level design for a 3D Metroidvania? Specifically, how might you plan for and keep track of heavy amounts of like backtracking, navigating with new abilities? How would you manage designing a game around that.
Yeah, I mean that was basically Prey, right? So I think the thing about that, excuse me, is managing your hard gates and your soft gates. So hard gates are you have to do this one thing to get to the next area, and soft gates are this is an impediment, a challenge, but there are multiple ways to get around it, or maybe you get around it before we expect you to, or whatever, right? So having as many soft gates as possible, like with Prey, we let you get outside the space station pretty early if you're if you're determined. If you like do a few things and explore and poke around, you can go outside of the space station and then you can travel up and down and you go all these different places. So allowing the player more freedom if they are sort of nosy or poking around, I think is very useful. And then only doing the hard gates where absolutely necessary. And also, if you're going to have any abilities that gate something, make sure the ability also does something interesting, rather than it is just a key, because that's not very interesting. And if it's like, oh, now the glue gun, for instance, like now I've got this thing and I can build bridges on walls and climb up stuff, and that's how I get out of this area. But it also has other uses, outside of that.
Cool. Are you seeing more use of procedural tools for grayboxing and level design, such as the Houdini engine?
Not as much in level design proper. I'm seeing people use it. In my experience thus far, right? I know they use it a lot in stuff like Spider-Man games and everything. And usually, like a tech designer will mess around with that and be like, "Hey, I found a cool way to do this thing that level designers can use." I've seen some people do things like, "Here's a procedural bridge tool or stairs or stuff like that." It's getting more and more traction, but in general, most of the rank and file level designers, including myself, I've looked afar or from afar at Houdini, but haven't really delved into it. I think a lot of level designers don't have the tech chops to dig into that, nor should they necessarily. If you had like technical level designers, like a very certain subset, then I think that would catch on. But if it's just like I'm a person that is concerned about the player having a good time, then they don't necessarily need to know all that. So it's I think it's getting more traction, but has a little ways to go. I think it's very cool stuff. I'm all for it.
Awesome. Yeah. Just a couple more questions here. If you guys have any more questions, make sure to post them now, just because we only have a few left. How far into the power fantasy can you go into? For example, in Path of Exile, the skill trees and builds within the game can allow some players to create super unique and overpowered builds, sometimes hitting hundreds of million in DPS. Would you say that this is a bad thing or a good thing?
I think it is a good thing. Everything I've done in the past from level design, some of this is like system design, and I don't necessarily have the deep knowledge on skill trees and stuff like that to give advice. But like with Prey, you had certain players that could scour the entire station and get all the resources and stuff like that, and then they'd be kind of overpowered. But that's fine as long as it's not boring, I guess, to them. But those people are outliers. They're on the far end, and so you wouldn't want to ruin the game or tamp it down for just the average person playing through. So I think you look at as much as you can look at an average playthrough. It's like, okay, they're having a pretty good time, and then if someone is obsessive and does all this stuff to be OP, then let them, because that's kind of what they're about. And yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. And here's our last question. What's your favorite project that you've worked on? What's your favorite level that you've helped design? And, what are some memorable challenges that you might have faced on those projects or on those levels?
So Moon Crash was my favorite project, because it was a follow-up. The dirty secret of game development is that most fun projects are the DLC projects, and the direct sequels and things like that, because you already have the tools, the know-how, and the momentum, and you can just roll right into whatever you want to build. All the DLC we did for Dishonored as well was super fun, because we had we were on our game basically in the groove. And so yeah, Moon Crash definitely my favorite project. Also because there were very few monetary expectations from that project. It was DLC. It was meant to be sort of a training ground for some procedural stuff that we may use on Redfall and stuff like that. So there wasn't a lot of pressure to do something lucrative. We could be weird, and we were weird. And so I think some of the challenge then came from making sure the level designers were on board that were more about storytelling and stuff like that, the traditional sort of immersive sim levels versus the sort of weirdo kind of randomly generated cobbled together stuff we were doing. So selling that to them, as well as then piecing together the sort of cause effect relationships of of the different runs you could take and what order you play what levels and how many times you play through and stuff like that. It wasn't hard necessarily. It was like a challenge that was interesting. Basically, it wasn't easy, but it was interesting and different. All that stuff, and then managing all the randomly generated numbers and stuff. Or like, okay, what configuration could the whole place be in this time? File a bug for that, and then chase down version 12,762 or something like that. So, and what was the last? That was the last question. I think I missed. Favorite level. That's a good question. Let me think. I think the crew quarters on Prey. I started on that before I got promoted to lead, so I pushed it a pretty far away before it was taken over. I think that was my favorite level because you're doing this sort of deep dive into these personal lives of people, and you're getting a lot of environmental storytelling and things like that from just everyday folks. I was a big fan. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with I Love Bees from Halo 2 from a long time ago, but it was very much about like these are the regular people that are living in this world of crazy alien stuff. So being able to tell those stories and all that was a lot of fun.
All right, awesome. I think that's it for questions. Is there anywhere that students could reach out to you or follow you for anything from you?
I am on LinkedIn. I am on Blue Sky. I think I'm R Wilson. Hold on, let me see what my profile name is. richwilson.bsky.social is my Blue Sky profile. And I'm probably going to burn my Twitter to the ground at some point soon. But that is that and LinkedIn.
All right, and you mentioned that you cat needs attention. You mentioned that you teach. Is that like an online course that you teach, or is that like at a university?
It's at the community college here in Austin. So
okay,
ACC.
cool. All right. I think that's it. If anyone has any last minute questions, probably just best to reach out to you on LinkedIn with those.
Sure. Yeah. If you want to connect through you or something like that, I can also probably give out an email like to you that you can send to people.
For sure. Yeah. That's it for today, guys. Thank you so much, Rich, for coming in. This has been a really exciting talk for me, and I hopefully for some of the other students here as well. Yeah, hopefully you had a good time with it as well.
That's all. Yeah, that was great.
Awesome.
Yeah,
all right.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. Take care. Bye.
Later.
Okay, I don't know if I can just end this call right now. Who's doing the Ubisoft Next Level Design Challenge after watching that? Because I kind of want to just